to my Excel for Scientists tutorial series. Today we're going to be focusing on how to summarize your data in Excel, things like getting averages, standard deviations, maxes, mins, errors, all of that stuff. As always, if you want to follow along with me and actually complete these things yourself with this same data, you can always download all of these files by going to the link in the description below and downloading these specific files. You can also download my cheat sheet while you're there or from a separate link in the description below that's going to have all of these formulas and everything teaching you how to use them. So you have a really quick cheat sheet to be able to reference to and be able to do these things without always having to come back and watch these videos to figure out how to do them. So today we're going to talk two different ways about summarizing data. And the first way that we're going to talk about it is summarizing the data by formula. So you can see we have in here, again, we're using very similar data. So we have some countries, the year, and prevalences of 4 different disorders in that country and year. Over here, I have a couple questions that I want to be able to answer. So the first one is looking for the average depression prevalence in 1990. One of the ways we could do this is to sort all of this by the year and then select an array. But today, since most people probably know how to just solve for averages and standard deviations, what I specifically want to talk about today is using if functions in them so that you can actually do this without touching this data at all, without sorting it or anything like it. This also helps it to be less error filled because if you just drag one extra column or one extra row down, then you might be including data that you don't need to include. So this is a little bit of a better way to do it. So to find the average depression prevalence in 1990, we're going to do equals average. And then instead of only doing average, we're going to do equals average if, and we're going to open. And so in here, we want to select a range, and this is going to be the range we're applying criteria to. So in this case, we want only years that are 1990. So we're going to have year, and then we're going to do comma, and then the criteria. So we want only those that are 1990. And then we're going to have our average range. So which column we actually want to do the averaging function on. And since we want the depression prevalence, we're going to click the depression column. And so now close parentheses and equals, now we get 4.17. So now it's only going through, and if it's 1990, if this column says 1990, it's actually going to include its counterpart in the calculation. If it says 1991, it's not going to include this information. So now we want to do the standard deviation, and we're going to do this one more time so that it really sinks in and is really clear. So for the standard deviation is STDEV, and what you can see is there is no STDEV if. So we can't apply that same logic like we did in averages for the standard deviation. So instead, we need to put an if function within our parentheses. So we're going to open it, and then we're going to do if and open. So now we need a logical test. So we need the test that the year, so we're going to input the column again, is equal to 1990. And so if that value is true, what we want it to report back is the depression prevalence. So what we want it to report back is this column. And if it's false, we want it to report back nothing or blank. We don't want it to report back 0. And this is really important here. If you put 0 in here, then it's going to keep adding in zeros for every year that's not 1990, and your standard deviation is going to be really high. So let's actually do that for a second because I want to show you. So then we close the if parentheses bracket, and then we close the standard deviation. And we get a standard deviation of 0.009. And this might be because most of your variance is actually coming from your real data and not instead of the other way around. So because most of your numbers are now 0, because for every year it's not 0. So instead, we want it to report back blank. So just an open quotation and a close quotation. And you see now we get a much more realistic number because we're not filling it in with all of these zeros. So that's the correct way to do it. So let's do it again. And I'm not going to copy and paste these. I'm actually going to walk through it again with you. If you want to try this by yourself, go ahead and pause this video right here, try it, and then you can restart the video. So we're going to have the average depression prevalence in 2000. So what we want to do here is we're going to, again, do Averageif, and there's also this Averageifs. So that's if we need multiple different criteria, we can use Averageifs instead of Averageif. So Averageif, the range, and again, this range is always going to be the range for the criteria, not the range that's going to be average. So again, we're going to do year for that. And then the criteria is going to be 2000, not 1990. And then our average range is, again, the depression prevalence. So we're going to hit that column in again and enter. And now we can see that our depression prevalence actually decreased by about 0.03%. And so now we're going to do the same standard deviation. So standard deviation, and this time I'm going to do stdev.s. That's actually the proper way to do it. Because stdev.s means that we're taking a standard deviation of a sample, not of the entire population. So open parentheses, we're going to input our if again. And then our logical test now is this column equal to 2000? And if that value is true, we still want it to give back the depression prevalence. And if it is not true, we're going to have it give back nothing, which is just that open and close parentheses with nothing in between it. And it's telling me, do you want to accept this correction? And it's because I forgot to close both parentheses. I only closed one of them. So yes, accept this correction. And now you can see it automatically inputted that second parentheses there. So that's how we can easily get averages and standard deviations without touching this data in Excel. So now we're going to do something a little bit different and actually do it based off the country, not based off the year. So let's do the average bipolar disorder prevalence in France. So we're going to again do Averageif, and we're going to do the range. So instead of the year now, we're going to have our range as country and our criteria. If I just put in here France, it's actually going to give me back an error. And so we're going to do the AA, the criteria is it's France, and we want to make sure we're selecting the bipolar disorder this time. So if I close this parentheses and enter, it's giving me an error. And it's giving me an error because this France is not within a string. So it's not looking for a string France, it's looking for something actually France. So what we would need to do is input this in quotation. The reason we didn't have to do this for the year is because the year matched the numeric. So instead of it looking for a string of 1990, it actually looked for the number 1990. So now if we do this, we get the average prevalence. So whenever you're putting in letters, you always want to make sure that they're within the quotations. So now we want the standard error. So if you know the standard error is standard deviation divided by the square root of the n. So what I want to do first is I want to calculate the number of years that we have data for, because that's our number of data points. So we want to do countif, if I can spell, countif. And so the range is this, and our criteria again is France. So now this is going to count how many times is France appearing, and we know that the number of times it appears is based off the year. So it appears 28 times, which means we have 28 years of data, which means our N is 28. So now we can use this number to get our standard error. So to get our standard error, we got to calculate our standard deviation first, and then we're going to divide that by the square root of N. So we're going to do stdev.s, open parentheses, if. So this is going to be the same thing again. We have to account for the fact that it is a string or it is text. So we're going to do the column is equal to quotation mark France, close quotation. The value if true is going to be the prevalence of bipolar disorder, and the value if not true is going to be blank. So that's going to be our standard deviation, and if we enter this, we get a number that is the standard deviation. But what we're looking for is the standard error. So what we now want to do is divide this by the square root of this number. Or if you wanted to put this formula into this to be able to automatically calculate it, you can do that. So now we're actually getting the standard error and not just the standard deviation. So this is super important because if I now wanted to sort this, say I was interested in something specific or I thought I had an outlier and I wanted to sort this by bipolar, largest to smallest, because I thought maybe my top one was an outlier based off my data. If I click OK, this doesn't change. So none of this will change its numbers because it is based off of actual logic. So even if these move positions, it's not going to actually change. And if I do Control Z, then these all stay the same as well because again, the number of data points didn't change, only their location did. And because our formulas aren't based off location, it doesn't matter. So then finally, we're going to do some max and min. So we want to figure out in the US, what is the maximum prevalence that it's ever been for these 4 different disorders, and what's the minimum? And obviously, I forgot to put an E here. So what we're going to do is have maxif. So maxifs. So there's no single maxif like there is Averageif. So we're going to do maxif. And so now what we're going to do, instead of having the criteria range first, it wants the max range first. So we're going to feed it in what it's actually going to be finding the max of, which is the depression. And then the next thing is the criteria range. And so now what I'm actually going to do is put $ around this. Because when I move this over, so if I go to anxiety next, well, anxiety is the next column over. So if it moves C's to D's, that's going to be exactly what I want. But if it moves A's to B's, then it's not going to be able to find what I'm looking for. So I'm going to put $ around that. And then my criteria. Well, my criteria is to find it in the US. And so if I just put in US in here, it's not going to find it because it's looking for United States. So what I want to instead put in is, again, I'm going to have my quotations because it's a text, but I'm going to put United States. And then close parentheses, enter. So now that's the maximum prevalence in the United States. And if I just drag this over, it's going to find it for all the others because it's just columns over. So if I go over 1, I'm in the anxiety. If I go over 2, I'm in bipolar. So this will actually work. If I didn't have those $ around the A column though, it wouldn't work because then it would look for United States in the B, C, and D columns instead. So now if you want to test this on min, you can do that. Or if you wanted to test it on other ones, you can do that as well. And I'm going to now show you the min. So we're going to do minifs. And it's basically the same thing. We want to find the min range first. So we're going to input in this. Next, we want the criteria range. So again, I'm going to put $ around this so I can easily move it over. And then we're going to have the criteria we're actually looking for. So United States is the criteria we're looking for. Close it off, and we get now our max and our min over this period. And these are all in percentage of the population. So we can see that the minimum prevalence of US for a given year was 4.65%, and the maximum was 4.84%, basically. And if you noted in an earlier video, I showed you how to move these numbers. So we can always decrease this so that it looks a little bit, simpler. But of course, since this is rounding up or down, this isn't really exact to how much change has really happened. So this said 7 to 6.5. Well, that's not really true. So we want to make it a little bit clearer by doing this. So that's how you can sum based off very specific characteristics or do aggregations of specific characteristics. Instead, what if I just wanted to average everything for a given year or a given country? Well, this could be the way to do it, but if I wanted to do this over and over and over again, so if I wanted it for 1990, 1991, 1992, that's a lot of extra work that could be done this way, but we want to do it a little bit of a different way. So what I'm going to show you now is how to use pivot tables. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the data we want done. So this is the exact same as this data. We're just going to summarize it a different way. So we're going to select the data we want. We're going to go to Insert and insert a pivot table in. This is going to pull the data you have selected, and then I'm going to just allow it to input it into a new worksheet. And we're going to click OK. So now this just gives me a new worksheet, but it gives me this over here that I can kind of play with a little bit. So let's say I wanted to just average everything by year despite the country it came from. So I'm going to add year to my rows. And so now I have all these years. And now what I want is the average and standard deviation of these different disorders. So I can pull depression down here, and it's automatically going to give me the sum. The sum in this case is not important at all. It doesn't actually tell me anything. So I don't want the sum of it. Instead, I can come either up here to field settings, or I can click the drop down here and go to value field settings. So you can do either one, and I want it instead to give me the average. So now I have the average. If I drag it down again, it's going to give me the sum. So if I click it, go to value field settings, I want it to give me the standard deviation instead. So now I have the average and the standard deviation, and you can do this for literally all of them. You just keep clicking these and telling it what you want, and do it again. So we could do it for the last two as well, but this is basically it. So we have the average and the standard deviations of all of our things. So now, what if I also wanted that country information? So if I want it to have all the countries, then obviously my standard deviation is going to be 0, but my average is just going to be the individual value because it's one single value, where the standard deviation does it by the degrees of freedom. So you have to have more than one value to get a real number here. So this is all of this information, but I can still see the average and standard deviation of the entire year up here. So I'm going to do is right click because all I want to see is the years. And I'm going to do expand and close, and I'm going to say collapse entire field. So now this just gives me my year and my information. And now if I personally wanted to see, okay, what was the prevalence for a given country in 2003, I can now look at it. So all of that information is still here and I can look at it, but it's not actually in my face, and I can have these aggregated functions or these summarized data. So what happens if I wanted it summarized by country and not year? Well, I could create a whole new pivot table that did that, or I can just move this country up. So now it's going to be summarized by country, and we get all of these stats by the country for multiple years instead of it just being by year. And if I wanted to collapse it by country, again, right click, go to expand and click collapse entire field. So now we have just the averages for these countries for all the years instead of it being per year. So that is two different ways to summarize your data. One is by using formulas, which is really good when you're trying to get exact data. And the other is by using this pivot table. And if you wanted to take this pivot table, you can always copy it and just paste it as values if you wanted to use it in a separate place. I hope this is really helpful, and don't forget that you can download a cheat sheet that has all of this information on it as well if you ever need to refer to it again. I hope to see you in the next video, which is going to be all about how to visualize your data within Excel.